So today we are going to be talking about the civil rights movement, and we are going to split this subject into two videos. But today we're going to start with a lot of the foundational piece of it, and the next video we'll talk about kind of the conclusions of it and the impacts of it. But the first thing we want to really talk about are different protests today, and we can see similarities with what we see today versus what happened back then. So we see groups today like the students that protested after the Parkland, Florida shooting at Mary Stoneman Douglas High School, the Me Too movement, the Black Lives Matter movement. A lot of nonviolent protests are really kind of the foundation of a lot of successful protests we see in our country today. We see marches in streets. We see people having a march on Washington. We see people holding up signs. We see people on social media now. We see people on news networks. We see people putting out commercials. We see all these different ways about how to garner people's attention. And today, with new forms of media, it's really easy to reach a lot of people to try to change their minds. So we're going to see a lot of these foundations of these nonviolent movements are going to have a lot of roots in the civil rights movement that we're going to be talking about today. So for my US2 classes, we're going to really be using guided notes for this. And so you can pull out that to really help go along with this content. The positives, obviously, we're going to be moving at a much faster pace. You have a lot greater ability to listen than rather write stuff down. But the problem is you're going to be writing down a few words. So you're really going to have to be paying attention and make sure that you kind of make notes outside of just what's written on the line, but kind of circling and highlighting things or making other extra notes that you need to really understand the information a little bit better. If you want one question to really sum up what we're going to be talking about today, it's this one. This is what you should be able to answer after today's video and even our next video as well, part 2 of the civil rights story. So what were the significant individuals and accomplishments of the civil rights movement? Now, that's a really vague question because there's so many people involved here, but I really want you to think about who is involved, what type of people are really taking on this charge and really picking up this mantle, and what are these actual gains they're getting. It's not just so much who are these people involved, but what successful things are they doing and what's getting them actual progress. The time period we're going to be talking about today, I'm going to be very specific. We're going to be talking about the modern civil rights movement. That means it's going to be from 1954 until 1965. These years are very important, and it's not to say that the other years aren't, but we're going to be focusing on this specific region of time. The reason why we use the term modern is because it implies that there's a lot before it. So you can really look at different things all from the very beginning, the first time African feet stepped foot on the shores of what would become the United States in the Jamestown colonies back in the early 1600s. And so there's a lot of change since then. There have been slave rebellions, there have been equality movements, there have been all these different changes, even the Civil War, but nothing quite like what happens in this 11-year period. So we're going to really be focusing on this time period. So those years, I gave you very specific years, so that must mean that they have some importance. So 1954 is the year a super important Supreme Court case was passed called Brown versus BOE, which stands for Board of Education, and it's going to end with the Voting Rights Act of 1965. This is going to be the largest progress forward since the end of the Civil War and the Reconstruction Amendments that come in the 5 years that follow. So this is going to be a lot of changes can happen in a very short period of time. Now, to set the context for what we're talking about, we really have to focus on what's going on in different regions of the country. There's racism everywhere, there's inequality everywhere, but it looks different depending on what region you live in. If you're living in the northern cities or you're living out west, African Americans are definitely going to be experiencing lower paying jobs. They're going to live in segregated neighborhoods, but it's not going to be anything like what you see in the deep, deep south where the tensions are going to be much more concrete and obvious. It's going to be much more in your face. Everything in society is completely segregated and separated. The Deep South is still really dealing with kind of Jim Crow laws, which were segregation laws all throughout society. And this is going to be going on since the 1870s until now. So it's been a very long time. You are going to see separate schools. You are going to see separate waiting rooms, separate drinking fountains, separate phone booths, separate hospitals, separate seats on trains and buses. All of these things are examples of ways that society was segregated. And this is every piece, no matter where you go in Southern society, things are going to be separated. They're going to use the term colors and they're going to use the term whites. So basically whites and non-whites. And there's going to be this heavy separation between everything. There are segregated everything in Southern society. So this is really the context that we're dealing with. The other thing to really understand is these people that are going to be protesting are going to be putting a lot on the line. There's going to be a lot of risk. There's going to be a heavy amount of violence that's used in the Deep South. It's very, very common. You're going to see people beaten. You're going to see the KKK rising and these cross burnings. But it's not just going to be people wearing hoods. Some people will do it very openly. They're not going to even try to conceal their identity. People are going to be hung in public and murdered. There are going to be people that are burned alive in very, very terrible ways. And some of these individuals are going to become the face of these protest movements of who people are fighting for. An example of this is a boy by the name of Emmett Till. Emmett Till was a teenager. He was visiting family down in the South. And when he was hanging out with friends one summer down there, he is going to be dared by one friend that you're not going to go up and talk to this woman. This woman that they saw walk into a grocery store or a corner store was a white woman. And he is going to go up to her and he's going to say, "Hey, baby," and that's about it. But he is going to be accused of grabbing this woman, of whistling at her, and her family members, her brother and another family member, are going to take it upon themselves to find Emmett. They're going to grab him, they're going to kidnap him, they're going to beat him, physically assault him. Then they're eventually going to take his life after they torture him, and they're going to throw his body into a river, and his body is going to sit there and rot for a couple days in the hot sun and soak all this water. And this young boy is going to be absolutely mutilated, and this is all they're going to find of his body. So your cases like this become kind of like the cornerstone of a lot of these movements where people are brutally assaulted. And names like today we would use the name like Trayvon Martin or Eric Gardner. These faces become synonymous with this movement for equality and people whose lives were taken in their own lives for just kind of living, that they weren't necessarily doing anything necessarily that dangerous. And so you're really going to have a lot of animosity and a lot of tension build up in these early years. Now that we understand the world in which these people are living in, we really can start to look at where does this actual progress begin? Where are we starting to see actual change in our world? And it's going to be kind of the focus of where do we want to see the most change? What's our goal? These leaders of these social rights groups that are actually advocating for social change are going to look for tangible ways, practical ways that they can create change. They know they can't change everything, so they're going to go very specifically and look for different areas that they can change or what their goal is. And their number one goal is to desegregate schools, to try to create more equality in the educational system. So Thurgood Marshall, who is a lawyer for the NAACP, which stands for the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, is going to use the U.S. Constitution, the 14th Amendment that was granted after the Civil War, to allow for equal citizenship. You have protections under the law. You have protections under fair and equal trial, protection from discrimination and violation of your rights. He's going to go after school segregation. He's going to go after that old Plessy versus Ferguson precedent, which stated that segregation was constitutional, that it allowed for it. And this has lasted since the 1870s. Plessy versus Ferguson says that facilities can be separate as long as they are equal, but we know they most definitely will not be. And these so-called equal schools, even if they were equal, we know they're not. They're going to be very inferior. They're not going to have adequate funding. They're not going to have adequate supplies and materials like white schools will have. But even if they were equal, because they are separate, that these schools, especially as they are going to really impact the way that Black children view themselves. It's going to have a psychological damaging impact on these children by everything around them telling them this is what Blacks and especially Black children deserve, and it's terrible treatment. It's terrible education, it's worse supplies, that people deserve better things because of the color of their skin, or worse things because of the color of their skin, which is absolutely ridiculous. But these are the lessons that society is teaching these children at a very young age. So because of this, this is violating a lot of their constitutional rights, especially the 14th Amendment right of equal protection that other citizens would be protected to. And so the Supreme Court is going to strike down school segregation. The Supreme Court is going to agree unanimously, which means that every single justice agreed that school segregation is illegal, that separate facilities are inherently unequal. And so Brown versus the Board of Education is going to call for the desegregation of schools at what they said deliberate speed. So two things to really note here. Number one, this only applies to schools. It doesn't apply to anything else, just schools. Number two, it says that schools have to desegregate, or states have to desegregate their schools at deliberate speed. So this doesn't give a hard deadline. So that may mean a month, 2 months, 3 months, half a year, a year. No one really knows exactly what that means. And when you look at the statistics, it's really shocking about how many people are going to use this loophole to try to prevent themselves from having to follow these laws. They're not going to give a hard deadline. They are going to say that this has to be done as fast as possible. And some states are going to play dumb and they'll say, oh, well, we can't do that. It's not possible. We need more time. We need more time. And ultimately, these deep southern states are going to really resist this movement. They're going to resist this order from the federal government. And when you look 6 years after this court case is passed, only less than 1% of Black students are attending school with white students. The segregation is still very real. So although they get a major court case decision, and this changes the way that society functions, it's not really getting actual change because people are resisting this movement. Not everybody agrees with it. So there's going to be a heavy resistance movement to the civil rights movement. We're going to see people that will try to funnel out students of color in different unique ways. For example, they're going to say that, oh, we can only take schools for students that are of a certain aptitude or certain morality. So meaning you have to be smart enough, you have to meet some certain standards. And if African Americans never had these opportunities before, it's going to be very hard for them to reach those scores. Now, say that these bright African American students actually do meet these scores and pass these aptitude tests, they may say, well, your morality is a little bit in question socially. Maybe you're causing too much trouble, or we don't know if we can trust you. So we can't let you into this school. You're going to have to go to another school. And all of the colored students, as they're going to say, are going to be funneled into one school, and all of the white students are going to be funneled into a different school. The white school is going to have better access to facilities. The white school is going to have more money, and the school for students of color is not. It's going to be run down and very poorly kept. Now, this is going to create a lot of social change, and this is a landmark decision. This is a monumental moment in history. This is where this really happens. But it's going to take more than just a law. It's going to take people taking action. It's going to take people protesting. It's going to take people actually demanding change in the world around them. This is one quick picture you can see in the upper left, school for children of color, in the bottom right, an all-white school. You can see the desks are much larger for those small children than they are for the larger middle school students. You can see up here in the top left corner. You're going to see better heating facilities, better buildings, better supplies, more materials in the white school down in the bottom right than you will available in the all African American school up here in the top left. So there is going to be a difference in experience and equality opportunities for people depending on the color of their skin, and that goes all the way down to children. Now, this is really going to take a long time to actually fix, and there's problems still today where some schools are still by almost kind of a matter of fact, de facto, are still almost segregated. But there is going to be extra efforts to try to integrate schools of schools of children of very diverse racial backgrounds, ethnic backgrounds. And you're going to see this for the very first time. One of the biggest ones is in Little Rock, Arkansas. In Little Rock, Arkansas, the governor, Orville Faubus, is going to be very, very against desegregation. He's going to want to keep schools segregated. You're going to see massive groups of people come out to support this movement. They're going to try to block off schools from getting integrated. You can even see signs in this photo here where it says, "Stop the race mixing. Race mixing is communism. That this is a threat to our life, and this is a threat to our livelihood. You can't make us do this." But what's going to happen is the governor of Arkansas is going to call in the National Guard to prevent these 9 children, who become known as the Little Rock Nine, from integrating an all-white high school, Central High School, in Little Rock, Arkansas. And so a lot of tension is going to build up. It's going to get so bad that the federal government is going to call in the armed forces to try to protect these girls that are and boys that are trying to go to this all-white high school. Large amounts of people all around them are going to be threatening them and spitting at them, swearing at them, calling them racial slurs, throwing things at them to try to prevent them from getting in the school. But the United States Army and Air Force is going to escort these children into school each day until things start to calm down. And so they're going to have a really hard time. The federal government is having to use the armed forces to get Black children into white schools. That's how tense this is. If you want to check out some raw footage of that and what that tension looks like, you can see that in that link down below. Take a look at that. And you can get a good sense of the animosity and really how extreme this is. When these Black students go into the school, parents are going to rush in and pull out their children from these school. White parents, that is, are going to pull their children out of these schools in large numbers. They're going to refuse to send them in. And this is the level of protest and resistance you're really going to see during this time period. Not everybody's going to comply. Not everybody's going to follow the rules. So how are we going to make people change their minds? How are we going to get equality? How are we going to change the way that people think? That's where these movements really start to pick up. The next big example of change following Brown is there is going to be a movement by individuals. Instead of waiting for the government to really take a charge on this, they're going to try to change the de facto way that society exists. And one of the most quintessential early examples of this movement is something called the Montgomery Bus Boycott. Many of you learned this story in elementary school. A woman by the name of Rosa Parks refused to give up her bus seat in a public bus in Montgomery. And what is going to happen is it's going to start a massive form of resistance. She is going to be arrested for refusing to give her seat up to a white passenger. That the rule was that Blacks were forced to sit in the back and whites could sit in the front. But if all seats were full, then white passengers could go and they could take any seat they wanted that was filled by a Black passenger and tell them to get up. It wasn't a request, it was required an issue, and she refused. Rosa Parks becomes kind of the face of this early movement, and African Americans successfully bind together. They're going to have to sacrifice in order to really get this boycott done. They're going to refuse to use the public busing system, and because they are the lowest end of socioeconomic status, African Americans are going to make up the largest proportion of individuals, especially in urban centers, that are using public transportation. If they refuse to use public transportation, the city is going to start losing massive amounts of money. So they're going to try to put the pressure on these cities and these towns to remove these restrictions and these laws by hurting them where it hits most. It hits hardest, their wallet. They're going to carpool together in order to get to work. Many people are going to be forced to walk. The Supreme Court is going to get involved and rule that the Alabama bus segregation rules are unconstitutional. So they're going to get that repealed. And you're also going to see the upstart of a very, very young minister from Atlanta, Georgia, that's going to rise as a famous civil rights leader in the years to come, Martin Luther King Jr. He is going to join in this movement and become this symbol, this young symbol of progress. These are our photos of individuals actually getting back on these buses in Montgomery. Rosa Parks was arrested, and this famous photo that's been colorized now of her getting her fingerprints recorded, but she was charged with a crime. Rosa Parks was not just this random old lady, though. She had been protesting for decades, but this is really where it kind of comes to light. Even after Brown divorced the Board of Education, there's still public segregation everywhere. Brown versus Board of Education only touches schools, though. It's really important to understand this is change over time. This is complexity. It only starts with schools, and it's going to translate much later on to other public facilities. They're going to carpool together. Church communities are going to work together to help get to other places. You're going to see Martin Luther King Jr. is going to be protesting there. He's going to be elected, but you can't force these people to take the bus. So they break the will down of the state governments to get them to repeal the laws. So individuals start to see that with a nonviolent protest movement, they are actually able to successfully create change if it's well organized. As MLK really gains popularity and uses the events of kind of what happened to Emmett Till and the Montgomery Bus Boycott, he is going to start to form sort of a committee to help go after segregation across this country. This isn't just a local thing. This is going to start becoming a national movement where he's going to go to different places of intense segregation to try to change the state of things. You may have seen this if you've ever seen the movie Selma. It depicts Martin Luther King Jr. and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference well in that regard. They are going to heavily use MLK's great speaking skills. He was a Baptist minister, and you're going to see a lot of religious connections to a lot of these individuals that are involved, really to support African Americans' cause, to really rally people. And his message is going to be nonviolent resistance, peaceful resistance. The idea that Christian love is going to prevail and be the basis for these efforts. Now, notice this is not pacifism, right? Pacifism means you won't fight back or resist in any way, shape, or form. Nonviolent resistance, or peaceful resistance, as sometimes it's called, is purposely going to agitate and question and try to fight other people's compassion to do evil, to do ill with peace, not fighting back, but purposely going to agitate. And so MLK will really push for that. But many will question his methods as these decades go on. This sort of kind of verse from the Bible of like turning the other cheek, or if cursed, do not curse back. If struck, do not strike back, but evidence love and goodwill at all times. We will match your capacity to endure suffering. We will match your physical force with soul force. We will not hate you, but we will not obey your evil law. So it's not just lying down here, right? We're not fighting back, but we're questioning and pushing against these laws. We will wear you down by pure capacity to suffer. We will overcome. And even Martin Luther King Jr. himself is going to face severe attacks, burning crosses in his yards, bomb threats, questions and assaults on his life are going to happen until eventually he will be killed at the end of the 1960s and 1968. So this is just one example of a lot of change. So we're going to see Martin Luther King Jr. really inspire so many people. His name is explicitly in the AP curriculum, so he's a name that we should get comfortable with, and hopefully a name that we do already know a decent amount about. The Montgomery Bus Boycott is a huge example of social change and social protest, but there are other ways that people actually create change. Students start picking up this idea of change. College students here in 1960 at the University of North Carolina A&T are actually going to lead protests called sit-ins. Sit-in is where they would go, and they would go into segregated lunch counters or segregated restaurants, and they would sit down at all white restaurants or all white seats at a lunch counter and try to get service. They would try to get a cup of coffee or a sandwich or some French fries, anything, and try to get served. And it's going to create a massive amount of tension. People are going to assault them. People are going to throw them on the ground. People are going to get violent with them. Some lunch counters and restaurants are going to completely shut down so that people can't even get in the door. And it's going to inspire a lot of other forms of protest. Now, notice all of these early protests are not violent. They're peaceful, but they are meant to agitate those around them, question the inequality. They'll go and they'll sit in at segregated restaurants called sit-ins. They're going to try to swim in segregated pools called wade-ins. They're going to go to churches that are segregated, even churches, the word of God, that all men are created equal under the eyes of God, that are all made in his image. There are black churches and white churches. There are segregated everything in societies all across the South. They'll try to go pray at a segregated church, an all-white church. So all of these pieces of society are completely segregated. And it's really important to understand how deep these tensions were and how difficult this process is. This is an example of some of the sit-ins that are happening in Greensboro, and they would go to these counters and just try to order lunch, but they're going to be faced with angry crowds that are coming around them. They're going to spit at them. They're going to pour things on them. They're going to attack them. Massive crowds are going to form. Some people are going to be pulled to the ground. They're going to be stomped on. You can check out a look at this clip right here. I'll take you to the middle of a documentary that will show what these sit-ins would actually be like and what violence these people would encounter. And it's very, very scary. All they were trying to do is order a cup of coffee or a sandwich at a lunch counter, and this is the discrimination they're going to face. Some places will even close. And look what that sign says: for the interest of public safety. That integration is going to be this absolute threat to safety. And if you look at these pieces of metal all throughout this photo here, they literally removed the seats at these counters so that people couldn't even sit down here. Some places closed their restaurant for a while to try to stop this swell of attempt of people trying to sit in at these restaurants. Because of these sit-ins, there's going to be a massive amount of people that are going to be heavily jailed. All these African Americans and other people that may have joined them, but mostly African Americans that are going to be sitting in. And so jails are going to start to overflow. So then they're going to put heavy pressure on the criminal justice system that they're literally not going to have a room for all these people that are being arrested for trying to integrate a segregated lunch counter. These people are doing the right thing, right? They're questioning inequality around them, but they will be labeled as criminals, and that's going to heavily be used in the media narrative of that time period. They're going to be questioning laws. Martin Luther King Jr. was arrested so many times, but the law is not always just. We teach children, especially people at a young age, to follow rules, that they're a good thing to do, but that's not always just, especially when the law is unjust. Like I said, there are other examples of protests. We saw these sit-ins at lunch counters. There are swim-ins, there are segregated beaches and pools, there are kneel-ins at segregated churches, drive-ins, there are segregated motels, study-ins, there are segregated universities. All of these are examples of questioning the status quo and trying to create change. Everything in society is segregated. Even though education is technically desegregated, there is still a heavy issue with schools, and there are movements for that. But all other aspects of society are still 100% legally segregated. This is an example of people trying to go to a white-only beach and swimming in the wrong area of the water, or being on the wrong side of the beach or the wrong area of the beach, that they literally segregated chunks of land where people could go into the ocean. That's the level that we're talking about. We even see this in 1964 in St. Augustine, where people are going in to pools to try to desegregate pools. They call them swim-ins. Now, this individual is pouring something into the pool, and at first glance, it's really hard to tell what's exactly going on. This man does not look too happy, and you also look at the face of these individuals that are screaming, like this woman right down here that's in the pool right now. Her face, she looks like she's in extreme pain, screaming for help. What could this man possibly be pouring in? It looks like he's pouring in a bottle of water. He's actually pouring in acid into the pool. This is the level of tension that is happening, that there is violence, outbreaks all over of people trying to peacefully desegregate these areas. So this is the level we're really getting to. These protests are going to continue to inspire one another, and people are going to continue to push this idea about what it means to be equal and how they're going to achieve that. And one way was through what were called the Freedom Rides. And the Freedom Rides were a group of students that bound together to go into areas of the Deep South that were heavily segregated. And they were going to try to integrate public facilities. They're going to protest segregated busing and public transportation. And so a group of individuals, both white and black, are going to climb into a Greyhound bus and travel all throughout the South. But when they go through there to protest, and they're not even going to be that, say, loud or necessarily disruptive as you would imagine, they're going to be met with a lot of violence. Their bus is going to be bombed. They're going to be arrested in very large numbers as they go to these different areas, highly tense areas. You can see them here getting on the bus, and you can see them with posters, and they're going to be kind of well known for, in the South, they're going to be labeled as troublemakers and trying to cause chaos in their cities. And so police departments are going to block them off on the highway and try to prevent them from going into their towns. And the police officers won't necessarily protect them from these violent mobs and violent crowds, from them trying to get into their cities. And it's going to create a lot of tension everywhere they go. This map shows how far they go. They go everywhere from Louisiana and Arkansas over to the Carolinas on the east. They go from Florida in the south up to Tennessee and Kentucky in the north. And so they go all over. In some cases, like in Jacksonville, Mississippi, or Jackson, Mississippi, rather. I'm going to highlight that right here. You see 306 people thrown in jail. So they create a lot of tension where they go, but really trying to question the unequal treatment. They're not doing anything violent, but they're going into areas of high publicity with a lot of people, a lot of segregation, and they try to protest, and they're going to be met with a lot of violence. In one case, their bus is actually going to have a firebomb thrown in it, and a fire is going to start, and they're going to be trapped in highly hostile areas. And so many people are even going to be hospitalized because you were going to see them jailed. You were going to see all of the tension that they're going to face throughout their time period, but questioning the inequality. And this continues to bring people into this movement. They're going to go after things peacefully, but be met with violence. And people can only withstand seeing this injustice for so long. This is what's left of their bus actually, and how badly it was destroyed, how badly it was burned. The entire top metal piece is gone and burnt to a crisp. So a lot of these people are being attacked for trying to question segregated facilities, and you're going to see how violent it actually gets here, as you see in these photos. Different universities are going to be ordered by the federal government to desegregate their schools by order of Brown versus the Board of Education and federal initiatives. And there are going to be students that are going to take that federal order, that desegregation notice, and hold burnings of them and hold rallies. And you see them holding up the Confederate flags here in this photo. You're even going to see at the University of Alabama, Governor George Wallace is literally going to stand in the way physically to try to block students from entering into the University of Alabama. Now, if you've ever seen the movie Forrest Gump, he gets involved in this scene and you kind of watch this happen. But George Wallace is a huge figure. I like him as an example of a lot of social change and political change because he is even going to take it where he is going to run for president about 4 times. He is going to be a huge vocal force that you're going to see in the civil rights movement trying to block, right? A governor of a state trying to block and resist the federal government, whether that be JFK, whether that be Ike, or especially LBJ. And you're going to see that. And if you've ever seen the movie Selma, he is depicted in that movie as well. This is another photo of Wallace being removed out of the way and the first black student being allowed to register for classes at the University of Alabama. Despite all of these protests, you'll notice that we haven't talked about any major laws that have actually changed, except for the Supreme Court ruling Brown versus the Board of Education. So there's still not a lot of actual social change, and people are questioning if this is really going to do enough to actually change people's minds and get more change in society. And it's really going to take off, though, this idea of protest and why they need to fight after the 16th Street bombing. So what's going to happen on an early Sunday morning in 1963? The KKK is going to set off a bomb in a church. So they're even going after holy places now. A Baptist church on 16th Street in Birmingham, Alabama. And 4 young girls are going to be killed on an early Sunday morning. The nation is going to be absolutely torn to their core. It's really going to spark the civil rights movement again about why they need to fight when innocent people are being killed just trying to worship. And so all of these examples are going to slowly build on top of each other. They're going to gain more and more momentum, and events like this are actually going to take it to higher levels. You can even see the level of destruction here. What's left of this church, it looks like it's almost completely incinerated. But 4 young girls lost their lives, these innocent lives, and it's really going to reinvigorate how people felt during this movement. Now, during 1963, there's a lot of violence for sure. 35 different black homes and churches were firebombed. Over 20,000 people were arrested during these protests. So things actually do pick up, and the tension's actually going to increase until the federal government really decides to do something about it. And Martin Luther King Jr. is really going to try to change public opinion. He's really going to try to reinvigorate the public. And really, the President of the United States, JFK or John Fitzgerald Kennedy, to openly support the struggle that African Americans are going through in this country. And he's going to do that via something called the Birmingham March. And so in the Birmingham March, they are going to try to march on the capital city of Birmingham in Alabama to try to push lawmakers to enact change. It's a huge, massive walk. It's going to be highly publicized on news networks across the country. And while it's being publicized, the police officer, the police commissioner in this area in Birmingham, his name is Bull Connor, is going to use a lot of brutal force to try to break up these protests. He is going to break out the fire department hoses and have them spray these protesters, which is going to rip off skin and force them into the ground and cause severe issues. They're going to use police attack dogs on these people. They are going to arrest so many different people. It's all going to be captured on camera, and the American public is going to be disgusted with what's happened and ask for change. They're going to demand change. All of this brutality is really going to shift the public sentiment towards pushing the civil rights, and the civil rights legislation is really going to start to build up, and it's really going to start to begin. You can see here in this photo that's actually captured and distributed around the country of people being hosed down with fire hoses. They shoot out so much pressure that it's going to absolutely break skin and cause severe issues and damages to people. You're going to see people attacked by giant German shepherds that the police are using to break up what they call these criminals who are protesting for equal treatment. And even Martin Luther King Jr. himself is going to be thrown into jail. So this movement is really going to start a wide variety of support across the country and a lot of change across the country about what is going on with inequality in this country. And you have this famous line here after he's thrown in jail that he writes in a letter that says, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." That he is calling for civil rights, he is calling for equality, and he's calling for change now. Ultimately, we are going to pick back up on this subject in a later video. So look on out for part 2, but we're going to stop here for today. We're going to pick up in the future on how is this country going to move forward from this point? What's going to happen once this movement gains steam? How much change are they going to get? What are they going to do once the federal government actually starts supporting these initiatives? How far can this movement actually go? So we'll pick that up in the second video. If you have any questions about stuff in this video, leave a comment down in the section below. I'll get back to you then. See you in part 2.